This is Unit 7B, Part 1. The way I'm going to describe this, we've already done the male reproductive system. So when I describe the female reproductive system, I'm going to refer to structures in the female system that are homologous to certain male anatomical structures. In fact, the default anatomy in a developing fetus is female. Male anatomy develops because of the effect of gene expression from the Y chromosome in males and production of male hormones that the tissue can respond to because it has the right receptors. And so male development occurs from a baseline of female structure, which is why males have nipples and they have no function. So I'll show you, I'll often refer to structures in the female as being analogous to certain structures in the male. With that in mind, that the two start out essentially as female. So in terms of primary female reproductive organ, it's the ovaries, and there are two of them, and they're in the peritoneal cavity, and they produce the female sexually reproductive cells, the gametes, which are called ova, that's plural, ovum for one. They also can secrete sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. The female reproductive anatomy, just like the male, has a structure of ducts that lead that reproductive cell along. So the reproductive cell, the ovum, is released from the ovaries or ovary, and then goes into the uterine tubes, and then into the, and if reproduction occurs, if fertilization occurs, often it's in the uterine tubes, and then it'll go into the uterus and implant, and then after 9 months of development, exit the full-term fetus exits via the vagina. So these are the internal genitalia, the ovaries and the internal duct system. The external genitalia are external organs that are can be observed from the outside. And here you see a mid-sagittal section through a female, and you also see the far side uterine tube and uterus. So in terms of structure, we have the ovary here, and then we have the uterine tube right there. And the uterine tube leads to the very end of the beginning, after the uterus, the beginning of the uterine tubes are these finger-like projections called fimbria. And then you have the uterine tube, and that joins into this structure here, which is the uterus, which is made of smooth muscle. And then the very end of it is called the cervix. So the end of the uterus that projects into the vagina is the cervix right there. And this is the vagina structure here. So, and just to orient you, this is the bladder here. All of this is the bladder, and there's the urethra. And again, to orient you, this is the anus here and the rectum here. Okay. In terms of external genitalia, we have there's I guess the mons pubis would be considered part of that. I don't know, or just part of the rest of the normal structure or external structures, but there's the clitoris, which projects outward. The very tip of it projects outward, but it also projects inward. And in some anatomical drawings, it's shown as even quite a bit larger. It's drawn here in the same way that the corpus spongiosum and corpus cavernosa, corpora cavernosa and corpus spongiosa was shown in the penis, because it also is made of this kind of spongy highly vascular space that can be filled with blood. I don't know if it's, I call it highly vascular, spongy structure that can become engorged with blood with sexual excitement and become erect. So that's the clitoris here. The main point I'm trying to make is that it projects inward inside the body quite a bit. This is the hymen, which is found just at the opening, and a thin piece of epithelial tissue. And the terms here, labium minus, labium majus, are not used because there's two, so it's plural. So it's labia minora, labia majora. These are the external genitalia, the lips of the at the vaginal opening. And the labia minora are the thinner lips, and the labia majora are the wider ones on the outside. All right. So those are the structures. We can also understand that all of the structures are held in place by ligaments. So there's ligaments holding the ovaries, there's ligaments holding the uterus in place. There's several different ligaments that anchor everything around. But it's just for your own information. I'm not going to ask you questions on the names of these ligaments or what holds what, which holds what. I'm not going to ask that. This is a posterior view of part of the vagina and the uterus. This is all uterus. And what you see is now, instead of a lateral mid-sagittal section, you see a posterior view, and you can see the two ovaries on either side. And you see the fimbria at the end of the uterine tubes, which are also called fallopian tubes. That's the older name. So there's the uterine tube on the right side, and there's the fimbria and the uterine tube on the left side, both leading into the uterus. And the uterus is made up of, there's a uterus, where is it? The uterus, well, it's showing different sections of the uterus. It's okay. Uterus. The uterus internal surface, the very internal surface of the uterus, as outlined here, is called the endometrium. And the rest of the tissue here, all of this tissue that I'm coloring in, is called the myometrium. That's the muscle layer, smooth muscle layer. For the cervix, we have a external opening or external os, and then a cervical canal, and then an internal os or internal opening leading into the main body of the internal space. Let's get it highlighted. All this in the uterus. So that leads in. Okay. Now, yes, the ovaries have a blood supply, and yes, they're covered with some connective tissue, but that's neither here nor there. the important thing to understand is that in the ovary, the outermost region of the ovary is called the cortex, just like the outermost region of the thymus or the brain or the lymph nodes or the, what other thing can I think of? The adrenal glands. It's called the cortex. So the ovary, the outer region is called the cortex, and found inside there are many, many follicles, and virtually 99.99% of them are called primordial follicles. And each month, randomly, one starts to develop, differentiate, mature. And it could be either on the left or the right side, again, random. It's a random event. One starts to mature, one a month. And that idea is shown here. It's in this next slide, but it's simplified. And what they've done, essentially what you have are many, many of these scattered, these primordial follicles, scattered throughout the outer region, the outer cortex of the ovary. And what this artist has done is shown that one starts to differentiate and mature and can be found through time maturing through these different phases. It becomes a primary follicle, then it becomes a secondary follicle, then it becomes a vesicular follicle, then it ruptures, the follicle ruptures here, and the egg is expelled, the oocyte is expelled, and the rest of the cells that form the wall become the corpus luteum. Now the artist has gone around in order to be able to show those various stages that a single primordial follicle goes through. He's shown them sequentially in an arc starting from here and drawing all the different stages all the way like that. But that's not how it does actually happen. Just one of these will start to develop and staying in one spot somewhere in the cortex will go through all of these different stages and rupture out, and then you get this corpus luteum, and then it's just this is a scar left over. That's what's indicated there. Okay, so it's not as if there's this whole range of different ones going all the way around. One thing I do want to show you is that the follicle that's almost ready to rupture and release the egg or oocyte inside is this kind of follicle here. It has what's called a space or an antrum. All of this is filled with fluid, and this is the egg that's almost ready to be released or ovulated. Okay? Right. So, within each follicle, there are all these different types. Within every follicle, you have an immature egg or an oocyte surrounded by a layer of cells. If it's a single layer, they're follicular cells or follicle cells. And if it's more than one layer, they're called granulosa cells. And so as the follicle matures and goes through the different stages, you get more layers of cells in the wall, and those are called granulosa cells. And remember, inside, in the middle, is an oocyte. And that's what's shown here, and we're going to go through that maturation. So at birth, females have all of the primordial follicles in their ovaries that they'll ever have. They will never develop more. Female newborn has those primordial follicles dotted throughout the cortex of her ovaries. But starting at puberty, what happens is that every month one one of those undeveloped primordial follicles, a single one, will differentiate into a primary follicle. Okay, here are the primary follicles. And that development will continue and it'll form into a secondary follicle. And here's a secondary follicle. And then it becomes and it's not written up here, but it becomes a vesicular follicle with this vesicular space. A vesicle is a fluid-filled structure. So here you have the vesicular follicle, and then it ruptures and the oocyte is released, and the rest of the cells, which were called granulosa cells, form the corpus luteum. So the primordial follicle has a single layer of follicular, I think it's follicular cells, not follicle cells, and it differentiates to a primary follicle that has granulosa cells, and then a secondary follicle that starts developing fluid-filled spaces, which eventually fuse into one fluid-filled space called an antrum. And here again you see this antrum filled with fluid, and the egg inside this is a secondary follicle. And then you get to the Graafian or vesicular follicle, which is ready to burst, and you have ovulation as the ejection, the rupturing right through the wall of the ovary, right to the outside, rupturing and release of a oocyte. And the cells that remain behind, which were the granulosa cells of the wall of the maturing follicle, become a corpus luteum. And here you see that corpus luteum right there. Okay, let's talk about the fallopian tubes. That's the old term. Again, I told you the names, things that are named after a particular person. Mind you, I don't know what kind of a name is fallop. I should look that up, but they're called uterine tubes. All right. So the uterine tube has at the end, closest to the ovary, these finger-like projections called fimbria. The next portion of it happens to be the infundibulum, then you have the ampulla, and then you have the isthmus. But let's just stick with a uterine tube that leads into and allows the egg to travel into the uterus. The uterus is down here. And let's stick to the fact that at the end they have these fimbria. All right. So when an egg undergoes ovulation, release from the mature egg, or oocyte gets released from the ovary, the finger-like projections of the fimbria draw it in by constantly undulating, waving, and creating a current to pull that oocyte into the uterine tubes. All right, the ovary is completely separate from the uterine tubes. It's detached. The egg has to float into the uterine tube. Okay, and if there is going to be fertilization, then usually it occurs in these uterine tubes. They have, as I said, no direct contact, not connected to the ovaries. The ovulated, released oocyte egg is set free into the peritoneal cavity, and then there are beating cilia on those fimbria that create currents to draw the egg into the uterine tube. It gets carried into the tube, down towards the uterus. There is some peristaltic action moving it down, and there's cilia there, ciliated action helping it move. There are other cells that are present on the wall of the uterine tube which are not ciliated, and they help keep the egg, the oocyte, and any sperm that have managed to get that far up nourished and moist. Okay, so an egg is released from the wall, and drifts, is drawn in by the ciliary action, drawn in to the uterine tube. And the next structure that the uterine tubes connect to is the uterus, which is hollow. It has quite a thick wall. The wall is made of mostly smooth muscle tissue. As I said, there are different sections, just like with the uterine tubes, there are different sections. And here, it's good for you to know that the body is the major part of the uterus, and the fundus is the rounded part here. Let me highlight it better. Here, this is the fundus, and the isthmus is the very narrow part between the main body and the cervix. Okay. So the opening of the uterus into the vagina is at the cervix. It's called a cervix. It's like a narrow neck that projects into the vagina. The cervical canal I showed you, it's between the internal os and the external os, and that's where that external os opens at the end of the cervix, opens up into the vagina. There are glands within the cervix, cervical glands, and they're constantly, and it varies at what point in the cycle, but not constantly, it varies at what point in the cycle the uterine cycle the woman is at, but they will secrete mucus, and that mucus covers the external os right at the end of the, if this is a uterus here, you have the opening into that space inside. So right here you have the, oh, I've lost it. Here it is, right there. That is the external os, and there are glands that secrete mucus, which will cover it and block sperm entry, except during mid-cycle. Female is most fertile, has the highest chance of conceiving at mid-cycle, which of course occurs at day 14. Okay, not sure why I have this here, but here it is. Let's move on. All right, in terms of the wall of the uterus, the internal wall is shown right along here. Let's get a thinner. All of that is the internal wall. It is lined with an epithelium. The epithelium dives down and forms these ducts and finally glands of these uterine glands. That's not good. Let's try this. Uterine glands. Okay, in the wall. Now the innermost layer is called the endometrium, and then further beneath that is the myometrium. So you have a thick layer of smooth muscle, and that forms the vast majority of the wall of the uterus. So the endometrium is the innermost wall. It changes in its thickness throughout the menstrual cycle. There are many, as I said, uterine glands all along it that dive down and are secretory. It has two major layers. The endometrium has two major layers. There is the functional layer, properly known as the stratum functionalis, and then there's the basal layer further in called the stratum basalis. And it's the structural layer that undergoes cyclic monthly changing or changes over in response to ovarian hormones. that is the layer that gets shed during menstruation. So this is the innermost layer, closest to the actual cavity inside the uterus. The stratum basalis is the layer that gives rise to the each newly forming functional layer, or stratum functionalis. So when menstruation ends, the stratum basalis starts to produce and undergo cell proliferation to form a new stratum functionalis. Okay. So in the wall of the uterus, when we look at the wall of the uterus, it has a particular kind of vascular supply that's quite unique. There are, of course, uterine arteries, all right, and they're along underneath, just underneath the surface of the uterus, and they send branchings up into the wall of the uterus towards the internal surface space of the uterus. What you have are uterine arteries, and also you have arcuate artery branching off the uterine artery. So there's a main uterine artery, and there's a branch, arcuate artery, and that's in the myometrium, and it gives rise from the arcuate artery. You get these that's the arcuate artery here, this structure, and it gives rise to radial arteries which go up into towards the very surface here in that direction. Those radial branches, okay, radial arteries, those radial branches go on to form straight arteries and spiral arteries. Okay, here's a straight example of a straight artery, and here's an example of a spiral artery right there, which is formed quite a tight sort of circular kind of a artery. The spiral arteries reach up and go all the way up into the functional layer. And although it's not shown here, so this is the functional layer. The straight arteries are much shorter, and they feed into the basal layer. So here we have the basal layer, and here you have the functional layer. And it's this functional layer. I'm going to put an F here. Functional layer and basal layer. It's the functional layer that gets sloughed off every month, and the basal layer gives rise to it. And straight arteries feed the basal layer, and spiral arteries will feed the blood towards the functional layer. Okay, what happens essentially with the menstrual cycle is that you get a sequential breakdown or degeneration followed by regeneration of these spiral arteries. All right, these spiral arteries, right? All these. So they're sequentially getting broken down, building up and breaking down. And that degeneration or breakdown will cause the stratum functionalis to essentially slough off and shed, because it no longer is viable, because it's not getting adequate vascular supply. Okay, if we move from the uterus into the vagina, It's quite a thin-walled tube. It is positioned between the bladder and the rectum. We showed that in the diagram, the mid-sagittal diagram. It goes or extends from the cervix, the tip of the uterus, right to the outside of the body, right out to open to the outside of the body. They don't refer to structures above and below the opening of the vagina as superior, inferior. They call it anterior, posterior. Okay, so the opening of the urethra, yes, is above the opening of the vagina, but the urethra, if you follow it up from the outside in, it's in the anterior wall of the vagina. And the vagina, of course, is a passageway for birth or menstrual flow, and is the receiving site for the male, I don't have to say male, of the penis during sex. Okay, it has 3 coats or layers. I wouldn't worry about it. The innermost is a stratified squamous epithelium. Not a single layer, but stratified squamous epithelium because of friction. For hopefully you can figure out obvious reasons. There is hymen in very young females, which could be intact or not after a while, depending on activity or sexual activity or not. But really, it's not a good indicator of whether someone is sexually active or not. I'm not going to talk about the fornix. It's a subtlety, really. It's just this space here, shown here and here. So I don't think that's that important. It's a subtlety in the anatomy. All right. This shows and I don't know why I didn't have a better diagram. There's a much better drawn diagrams by a very famous medical artist who drew tens of thousands of, in his lifetime, tens of thousands of medical diagrams of all the body and internal organs. If you ever want to see proper anatomical drawings, medical anatomical drawings, look up the artist called Netter. Anyhow, this is a poor drawing of the perineum, which is an area here outlined from this point here in a diamond shape, going just below the anus and just above at the top of where the labia majora meet, just above the clitoris. Now, those were all the internal structures in the reproductive system. And in the peritoneum, did I say peritoneum? Perineum, you can see the external genitalia, which are called the vulva, lying external to the vagina, include the mons pubis, the labia minora and labia majora, and the clitoris, and vestibular structures, at least the openings of vestibular structures. I'll explain what those are after. Again, not a great diagram. Oh, yes, here we are. So these openings here, this is the opening here of the vagina, and here we have the clitoris at the top. This is the opening of the urethra. And what you see, and again the dotted line is the area called the perineum. And what you see are, one is labeled, the other one is not, but you see the openings of the greater vestibular gland right here, just posterior to the opening of the vagina, and immediately just slightly posterior here to the opening of the urethra, you see what are called the openings of the lesser vestibular glands, and I'll explain what those are. Now, as I told you, between males and females there are homologous structures. So in fact the penis is homologous to the clitoris is homologous to the penis. It's a homologous pair of structures that have differentiated into seemingly quite different structures but originate from the same kind of tissue. They both have erectile tissue. The clitoris is hooded over the anterior side with prepuce. Okay, now the prepuce is in fact another term also in the male for the foreskin. So it's again a homologous structure. The prepuce is homologous to the foreskin. The very exposed portion, remember I showed you that in the diagram that I can't go back, so I'll stick to this here. The exposed portion, there is an exposed portion projecting outward at the surface of the clitoris, but a lot of it is in fact embedded deeper into the tissue. The exposed part is called the glans, just as the end of the penis is called the glans. It's the clitoris is a highly innervated structure with many sensory nerve endings. Now, as I said, right near the opening, right just slightly posterior to the prostate, anterior to the vaginal opening, are the openings of the lesser vestibular glands. These glands keep the urethra lubricated. It's not completely certain what the exact function is, but it has possibly an antimicrobial effect, the secretion from these glands. These glands are believed to be homologous to the prostate, okay, of the male. Now, posterior to the opening of the vagina, and on the posterior, and the glands themselves are deeper in. The openings of the glands secrete to the outside via ducts, and the openings of the ducts are slightly below or posterior to the opening of the vagina. But inside are these pea-sized glands on either side of the posterior wall, which you might consider the lower wall or the more dorsal wall of the vagina, but not on either side of the posterior wall of the vaginal opening. Yeah, it's okay. This is believed to be homologous to the bulbourethral glands in terms of the tissue of origin, sharing the same origin as the bulbourethral glands in the male. And the purpose of the glands, the secretion of the glands, is that it helps to keep the vestibule moist and lubricated, particularly during sex. Let's see if I have no, I don't have another diagram. Okay. Let's go to mammary glands. Your book includes mammary glands, breasts, in sexual reproduction. I don't get it, but so mammary glands are for feeding the child, feeding infant. They are in fact modified sweat glands. They have several lobes, and the structure, and you'll see that on the next diagram, the structure of the lobes are reminiscent sort of the structure of the lungs. It has these alveoli or grape-like structure clusters, very small alveolar shape of clusters of gland tissue. So each lobe has many of these glandular alveoli that can produce milk in a lactating female. Females lactate if they've become pregnant, and that milk that it produces can be passed into the lactiferous duct that opens to the outside. The pigmented skin around the external nipple is called the areola. Let's have a look. So here we are. This is a lobe here. That's a single lobe shown in cross section. There's another lobe leading to these lactiferous ducts, producing milk and secreting it into the lactiferous ducts which open to the outside. Notice it's multiple openings to the outside at the nipple, and then the colored portion here of skin around the nipple is called the areola. So we have one slide on a topic, breast cancer, which you could talk with 100 slides, and maybe people would be more informed. Although there's plenty that isn't known, and the treatment, in fact, is really developing and changing with time. Breast cancer typically is because of a loss of growth control of the epithelial cells in the ducts in the breast. If a tumor is epithelial in origin, and this goes for any tumor, not just breast cancer, but if a tumor is epithelial in origin, you remember that there's 4 major kinds of tissues: epithelial, muscle, nervous, and connective. If it's epithelial in origin, then it's called a carcinoma. So if you hear the term carcinoma, you know that the tumor is of epithelial origin. There are a number of recognized risk factors or features or characteristics that increase the risk of developing breast cancer, and that includes an early onset of menses, the menstrual cycle, or a late menopause, no pregnancies or a first pregnancy late in life, previous history of breast cancer, and a family history. In other words, there's a genetic component, and indeed one of the genetic components is having certain types of mutations in these genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2. Now, despite the fact that there are known risk factors that predispose individuals to a higher risk of developing breast cancer, nevertheless, as high as 70% of women who develop breast cancer, in fact, have no known risk factors. The other 30%, yes, but in 70%, there's no known risk factor. They must clearly have a number of characteristics or have undergone something that they share, or several different things that some of them share characteristics, but these have not been recognized. Okay, early detection is extremely important. That's done by self-examination, and it's too bad we don't have the active lab, because we have a very nice model of a breast made of soft tissue, and it has in it harder areas of different sizes that have the same feel and texture as early forming nodules or potentially tumors in the breast. But early detection is by self-examination, which every female should carry out, and also by taking mammogram. Treatment really depends on the characteristics of the lesion, what its histological or pathological structure characteristics are of the tissue itself, how primitive the tissue looks, whether it looks a different, it's hard to explain, but there are different stages that can be recognized depending upon the loss of differentiation characteristics of the tissue. The less differentiated it is of the tumor tissue is, then the typically more aggressive growth you get. That goes for all types of tumors. Treatments include radiation, chemotherapy, surgery followed by radiation and chemotherapy. Now the most common kind of approach is lumpectomy, which involves just taking out that area of the nodule and around the nodule, and that's used much more commonly now than what were surgical techniques that were used more frequently before. And those techniques include a radical mastectomy, removal of the breast and some of the muscle tissue underneath, or modified radical mastectomy, where none of the muscle tissue underneath is removed. But now the majority of women who are diagnosed with breast carcinoma receive a lumpectomy. And that's where we'll stop. This is the end of Unit 7B, Part 1.